Good evening, everyone. Welcome to ASPI. For those who haven't been here before, I'm Dr. John Coyne. I'm the head of the Strategic Policing and Law Enforcement Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Before starting, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land that we are meeting on, the Ngunnawal people. I want to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I would also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's event. In a think tank like ASPI, there is no single week which is ever the same. The volume, velocity and variety of policy challenges our nation currently faces means that we're always in a policy sprint, and this week is no different. On Monday night, we hosted in this room here an event examining human rights in China, focusing on women, minorities and technology. And tonight we consider modern slavery in Australia with a focus on the agricultural visa. I would like to welcome our guests for this evening. Distinguished guests for this evening, I should say. Lorraine Finney, the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, Professor Jennifer Byrne from the University of Technology, Sydney, Lena Garcia from the Australian Red Cross, and Elise Gordon from Walk Free. In the day and age of COVID, I'm guessing I don't need to apologise for the fact that we've gone from a all here non-virtual event to a mixed virtual event because of COVID. What I do want to do before handing over to our speakers is say the following. In 2021-22, the AFP received 294 reports of modern slavery and human trafficking in this country, an increase of 224 in the previous financial year. Of those 294 reports of human trafficking or slavery, 84 reports were of forced marriage, 54 reports were of sexual servitude and exploitation, 42 were of forced labour, 37 reports of exit trafficking in persons, and 21 of trafficking in children. Human trafficking, modern slavery are problems. They are problems here in Australia today. Whilst the increase in reporting can be reviewed or viewed as a positive result of excellent work by all involved in the sector, the implications are that we're seeing an increase in referrals while we experienced a decrease in people movement into Australia. During the pandemic, migration flows across the region came to a large screaming halt. Many and experts sat back in places like Bangkok welcoming this, saying this is an end to human trafficking and modern slavery, or at least a pause. In reality, what it created was an increasingly desperate cohort of people who were increasingly desperate and vulnerable to exploitation. Last year, the Australian government made a series of announcements regarding the visa reforms to supplement the agricultural sector and its labour supply. The first change was to absorb the existing seasonal work program and Pacific Labour Scheme in the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. The second change was establishing a separate visa category called the Australian Agricultural Visa. Since then, unions, academics, human rights groups have all raised concerns about the regulatory vulnerabilities of these schemes to worker exploitation. Earlier this month, Senator Murray Watt, the Minister for Agriculture, stated that a separate agricultural visa wasn't necessary, but the right frameworks around the existing system are required. Last week, New South Wales peak farming body said that some 100,000 fewer backpackers in this country meant a critical shortage in labour supply. To put tonight's event also in context, the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act of 2018 is currently being reviewed. A public issue paper is due for consultation in mid this year and the final report due in March 2023. Much will need to be done to make sure that these right frameworks are identified and put in place. No one really came here to see me or hear me speak this evening. So what I really want to do is hand over to the experts who will take us through the night. First off, I have the great pleasure of introducing Lorraine Finney, who is the Human Rights Commissioner. She leads the work of the Commission in Modern Slavery, Asylum Seekers and Refugees, business and human rights, and technology and human rights. She is a lawyer and an academic, and the former senior human trafficking specialist with the Australian mission to ASEAN. Lorraine holds a dual masters in law from New York University and the National University of Singapore, where she studied as a Singapore scholar. We are in your hands, Commissioner.
Well, thank you so much. And can I do the usual thing and just check that everybody can hear me okay? Brilliant. Well, I'd like to begin by echoing Dr. Coyne's words, which is to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight. I'm here in Canberra, so the Ngunnawal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples at the event this evening. I'd also like to thank ASPI for inviting me to be part of this event and to apologise to all of you for the belated change in circumstances that have meant I'm by necessity appearing remotely rather than being with you in person. So my apologies for that. What I've been asked to do tonight is to really set the scene for the panel discussion that will follow, which will look at the modern slavery challenges in Australia and its supply chains with a focus on the agricultural industry and the agricultural visas. And to do that, I would really like to address three foundational questions. The first is, what do we actually mean by modern slavery? The second is, why does it actually matter whether we eradicate modern slavery or not? And thirdly, how is Australia responding to modern slavery? And I do feel that sometimes we get so caught up in actually moving forward in the space of modern slavery that we actually forget to take a step back and think about these foundational questions and why they're actually important. And I'll explain, hopefully, in the next few minutes, why I actually think we do need to go back a few steps and really think about these conceptual foundational issues to be able to actually take the steps on the ground that we need to combat modern slavery. And at the risk of spoiling the ending for you, the observation that I really want to leave you with tonight is that while Australia has been a global leader in eradicating modern slavery, in my view, we're not doing enough. And in my view, we need to be doing a lot more, both domestically and globally. So to start with, what do we mean when we talk about modern slavery? The first thing to note is that when we're having this discussion here tonight, we have a common understanding of what modern slavery means. This is a term that's clearly defined under Australian law, and over the past few years, it's a term that has become widely understood in Australia. The statutory definitions provided under Section 4 of the Modern Slavery Act 2018, and in Australia we use it as an umbrella term, using the definition provided in the National Action Plan as being one that, and I quote, refers to a range of serious exploitative practices, including trafficking in persons, slavery, slavery-like practices, and the worst forms of child labour, end quote. Importantly, however, we need to recognise that this common understanding doesn't exist across the world amongst nation states. There's simply not a universally accepted definition of modern slavery amongst the nations of the world. And while modern slavery is a concept that's defined in some jurisdictions, such as Australia, the definition used isn't uniform in all of those jurisdictions. And there are many countries that don't recognise the concept at all. There are still only a relatively small number of countries worldwide that have either introduced modern slavery laws or have indicated an active consideration of introducing modern slavery laws. Similarly, while there are a range of bilateral and multilateral agreements that address specific conduct that falls under the umbrella of modern slavery, and trafficking in persons is a good example of that, there are no binding regional or international agreements between nation states that actually use the concept of modern slavery in a legally significant or binding way. Now, of course, there are a range of human rights instruments that are relevant to modern slavery. For example, Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides that, in part, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. The global community has also clearly agreed to an aspirational goal with respect to modern slavery when you look at the Sustainable Development Goal 8.7, for example. And there are core international obligations with regard to specific forms of exploitation that come within the modern slavery umbrella. But a comprehensive and binding commitment to eradicate modern slavery in its full sense, or even an international consensus between nation states about exactly what modern slavery is, simply doesn't exist. And that actually surprises a lot of people in Australia who are quite used to using the language of modern slavery. At an even more fundamental level, the Anti-Slavery Legislation Database Project, led by the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham, reported in 2020 that half of all the countries in the world had not yet made it a crime to enslave another human being. The point of taking you through all of this is simply to establish that while we're here tonight talking about modern slavery and the importance of eradicating it, we actually need to understand that there are really significant fundamental gaps in our global anti-slavery framework. And this is important to acknowledge for two key reasons, one conceptual and one practical. The conceptual reason is that modern slavery is a global problem that requires a global solution, which means that establishing a common global understanding of what we're actually trying to combat is always a necessary first step before we can realistically hope to address the problem. The practical problem is that combating modern slavery requires transnational cooperation, which requires justice systems and public agencies across different jurisdictions to be engaged. Clear legal definitions and binding legal obligations are absolutely critical to ensure at that regional and global level that cases can be properly identified as belonging to a specific legal category, that the correct legal framework can be applied, and that support services can correctly identify victims and provide appropriate supports. This was perhaps best put by Professor Janie Chuang in 2015 when she said, and I quote, "Legal definitions matter when it comes to providing a common basis for governments worldwide to collect and share data, to facilitate extradition of criminal suspects, and to pursue policy coordination with other governments. They also matter when it comes to individuals directly affected by the legal regimes designed to identify perpetrators and provide redress to victims of slavery, trafficking, and forced labour practices," end quote. Australia's International Engagement Strategy on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery, which was released earlier this year, is subtitled Delivering in Partnership. It might be suggested that there can't be a partnership at all unless there is first a shared understanding of what you're partnering on. There are a whole range of really worthy engagement priorities and strategic objectives that are outlined in the International Engagement Strategy. But amongst all of that positive activity, I would encourage us not to forget the essential first step. Namely, we need a shared understanding globally of what modern slavery is, and a shared understanding of why a commitment to eradicating modern slavery is actually important. We can't simply proceed in Australia on the assumption that this shared understanding exists at the regional or global levels, because it simply doesn't. Rather, Australia needs to proactively take a leading role in trying to establish that international consensus that we need if we're going to have any hope of eradicating modern slavery. So that brings me to the second point, which is, well, why is eradicating modern slavery important? There's obviously a clear moral imperative. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is based on a recognition of the inherent dignity of humans and the inalienable rights of all members of the human family. At its most simple, slavery is an affront to that. It's dehumanising, it's profoundly wrong, it should never be accepted or tolerated, and it can never be justified. And yet, it's currently estimated that over 40.3 million people are living in modern slavery. 24.9 million of those are living in conditions of forced labour. 1 in 4 victims are children, and 71% of victims are estimated to be women and girls. Put bluntly, this is a moral stain on humanity. By itself, that moral argument should be enough to demand a response. But in addition, there are also powerful economic and strategic arguments as to why combating modern slavery is in Australia's best interests. Economically, the cost of modern slavery is estimated at $20 billion a year US in terms of lost wages, and is estimated to generate $150 billion US annually in illegal profits. The Australian Institute of Criminology estimated recently that the human cost to the Australian economy in 2020-2021 of serious and organised crime involvement in human trafficking alone was somewhere between $55.5 million and $111.5 million. So the economic cost, as far as we can estimate it, is not insignificant. Strategically, we know that 2/3 of the victims of modern slavery are estimated to be in our region, in the Indo-Pacific. We also know that the underlying drivers of modern slavery include poverty, discrimination and marginalisation, civil disruption and armed conflict, natural disasters, and weak rule of law frameworks. If we want to live in a region that is stable and prosperous, and if we want to strengthen the international rules-based order in our region and strengthen regional resilience, then our efforts in eradicating modern slavery can only help to advance these broader strategic goals. So given that there is a moral imperative, but also economic and strategic benefits to eradicating modern slavery, how's Australia responding? Australia prides itself on being a global leader in this area. And indeed, in terms of national responses, we were the second country to introduce modern slavery laws. We were the first country in the world to introduce a public online repository for modern slavery statements. And at the regional and global levels, we're one of the few countries in the world to have a dedicated thematic ambassador. We take a leadership role in regional and global initiatives like the Bali Process and Alliance 8.7. And we've invested significantly in counter-trafficking programs such as the $80 million ASEAN Australia Counter-Trafficking Program, or ASEAN Act. But we can and we should be doing more. As a starting point, we need to recognise that modern slavery actually happens in Australia. It's not just a problem for other people in other places. The Global Slavery Index 2018, produced by the Walk Free Foundation, estimated there are 15,000 victims of modern slavery in Australia. But Anti-Slavery Australia has highlighted that between 2004 and 2021, there were only 1,670 modern slavery cases referred to the Australian Federal Police and only 31 offenders convicted. They estimate that only 1 in 5 victims are detected in Australia. What this suggests to me is that while there are many really important anti-slavery initiatives, policies and strategies being put in place in Australia, and while there are clearly a huge number of committed people within Australia working to protect victims and prosecute perpetrators, we're only really hitting the tip of the iceberg. This conclusion aligns with the 2022 Trafficking in Persons report recently released by the US State Department, who ranked Australia again as a Tier 1 country, which means that we fully meet the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. But they identified a number of shortcomings and made some recommendations about future priorities, which are particularly relevant for the discussion we're having tonight. For example, the TIP report specifically recognised the vulnerabilities of migrant workers in Australia, and they identified the agricultural industry as a high-risk industry with reported cases of forced labour and other forms of exploitation. The seasonal worker program, as it was then known, was specifically identified as a program with heightened risks of forced labour, given the use of tied visas. So if we accept that we need to do more, and I'll finish on this point, what should that look like? The statutory review of the Modern Slavery Act announced earlier this year provides a positive opportunity to think about how we can strengthen Australia's legislative response. This independent review, which is being led by Professor John McMillan, is required to be completed by March next year and will consider the operation of the Act over the first 3 years and whether further measures to improve the Act and improve compliance are necessary. I see the review and any resulting legislative reforms as a necessary but not in itself sufficient step in strengthening Australia's response to modern slavery. In addition to ensuring we have a strong and robust legal framework, we also need to think about how our broader policy settings might contribute to modern slavery risks and the practical steps we can take to minimise or address those risks. That's where tonight's discussion about the agricultural industry and agricultural visas is so important. In terms of modern slavery, we know that the agricultural industry is a high-risk industry, and we know that migrant workers are a vulnerable cohort. If we are serious about being global leaders in combating modern slavery, we need to lead by example. And we need to start by strengthening our own efforts to prevent modern slavery from occurring within our own borders. I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion tonight. I hope that's helped set the scene in terms of some of the challenges that we're facing. And I'm particularly looking forward to listening to the ideas of the expert panellists about what more we can do within Australia to prevent a really serious problem that's occurring within our borders. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Commissioner Finlay. I've actually, as a moderator for this evening, done what most academics and most really passionate people really hate. So I've asked our three speakers to speak in 10-minute slots. And if they go over, I'm going to get really cranky and pull them up so that we have time for questioning at the end. It's a terrible sin to do that to passionate people, so I apologise. Secondly is these three amazing professional women who are driven and passionate in this area. I'm going to do them the injustice of only doing a very brief introduction. They have lengthy histories and lengthy achievements, and by no means does my short introduction diminish that. So first off this evening, Lena Garcia is the lead for trafficking, forced marriage and forced labour at the Australian Red Cross. And Lena, we are in your hands for your opening comments.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. I first would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we are all dialing in from and meeting in. In my case, is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. As I was saying before, like it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I will try to be brief and stick to the 10 minutes. So like I really want first, before like starting getting into the topic, I would like to highlight that when we talk about vulnerabilities of migrant workers and exploitation in the agricultural sector, we firstly need to note that this is not a new subject and in fact is a very well documented matter. There have been multiple reports, more than 11 according to the Australian Workers' Union, including among others the Select Committee on Temporary Migration Report and the Inquiry Selected Committee on Job Security Report and the Fair Work Ombudsman Harvest Trial Inquiry Report. All have identified different forms of abuse, underpayment, mistreatment, and other poor working conditions that may involve indicators of modern slavery in the Australian farms. Reports have really brought up examples of workers harvesting produce for entire days without any food or drink and for no pay. Examples of sexual abuse of workers being forced to live in sheds with animals, forced to sleep in precarious conditions and confined, and being threatened with firearms. Reports of workers being threatened to be deported or reported to the authorities. Workers working in 40 degrees with no breaks, no toilets, and no water. And workers paying $100 per week each to leave 70 people to a 5-bedroom house. So when we see this established evidence of labor exploitation in the horticulture sector and all the analysis done on this evidence, we can easily divide the conversation into two big groups: the systemic issues and the individual issues. When we talk about systemic, we need to think about those elements of the Australian system that may have contributed to exploitation. Just to mention a few. First, a widespread non-compliance with Australian workplace laws, and limited resources and capacity of the Fair Work Ombudsman. And together with these, not severe penalties for bad behavior and identified exploitative practices. Second, the design of the visa system and some type visas requirements. I will not expand on these, as I am sure Jennifer will do much better than me on this specific topic. But the design of some employer-sponsored visa schemes and the way seasonal workers are brought to Australia may be contributing to exploitation. Third, a misuse of piecework arrangements, leaving workers without an income safety net. Until very recent, there was no way of ensuring that workers were not earning below the minimum wage while working under a piece rate agreement. And fourth, there is not a strong national labour hire licensing regime. Despite in recent years, the Queensland, Victorian, Australian Capital Territory and South Australia governments have enacted legislation to license labour hire businesses, further reform is still required at the national level. And lastly, a significant reliance of employers on overseas workers with limited or not English, limited awareness about their rights and how to seek help and support. And I want to be clear, the issue here is not the reliance on migrant workers. The issue is the lack of awareness around indicators of exploitation, about what to do, where to seek help, what are the work rights in Australia. That is the issue. But all these systemic issues are worsened by the individual of migrant workers issues in itself. Let's look at that. First, there is a culture of silence. Migrant workers are usually reluctant to pursue actions to recover pay, to report a situation of exploitation, to seek help and support. Why? There are multiple reasons, but evidence has shown that this reluctance may be due to previous negative experiences with authorities, including in countries of origin and Australia. Second, fear of retribution, including further harm to themselves or their families from the perpetrator, especially when they have received multiple threats from the employer or the recruiter. Fear of shame or stigma, including from family or community, especially when they have come to Australia with the hope to support family and send money back. Fear of consequences of insecure or unknown immigration status, such as immigration detention or deportation, especially when the common message they receive from the employer is, we will report you to Home Affairs, or if you quit, you will not have a valid visa anymore. Fear of losing employment and loss of livelihood. And lastly, fear of not being believed. As a humanitarian organization and as part of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, Red Cross delivers the Australian government's support for trafficked people program, as well as other labor exploitation awareness projects. We deliver a comprehensive, complex casework service that is responsive to individual needs, guided by clients' voices, and uses strength-based and trauma-informed casework approach. Through this work, we have gained extensive direct experience in identifying and addressing the needs of people who have experienced labor exploitation. These individual issues that I was referring to just a few seconds ago is what we see every day. And is also what our data is telling us. If we see the numbers of referrals to the Support for Trafficked People program, from all 573 individuals referred since 2009, only 26 have identified agriculture as the perpetrating industry. Only 26 people referred for exploitations in farms in Australia. This only demonstrates that a lot of these other people that we were talking about before that have been identified in those multiple reports mentioned at the beginning of my response are falling through the gaps. The remoteness of the working locations, combined with workers' dependence on employers for all their basic needs, including accommodation, transportation, communication, and food, their language barriers, their fear of authorities and fear of navigating an unknown system, their lack of knowledge and understanding of the Australian laws, the delays in their process, all of these is contributing to the lack of identification and an increased vulnerability to exploitation. As one of our clients previously mentioned, I was in the middle of nowhere. I had nowhere to go, no transport, no buses around, no phone, nothing. I was sleeping with a lot of other workers, mainly from Asia, and the majority did not speak English at all. My payment was taken to repay the expenses incurred for taking me to the farm. This is why one of the biggest pieces of work we have been developing as a sector is a model to broaden up the referral to the support program, allowing agencies different to policing agencies, such as the Australian Federal Police, to assess indicators of exploitation and refer to support. This model has been presented to government as a result of 9 months of work of civil society organizations and is being considered by government at the moment. Broadening the referral pathway will address one of the biggest barriers in the identification of workers subjected to labor exploitation, the fear of authorities and the reluctance of telling their stories because of the consequences this might bring to their immigration status, safety, and well-being. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Lena. Professor Jennifer Byrne. Professor Byrne is the Director of Anti-Slavery Australia at the University of Technology, Sydney. And I have definitely not done justice to her bio by saying that, but we're in your hands.
Oh, thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with you all. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and continuing, and acknowledge them as the custodians of knowledge for this land. It's a real delight to be with you all. I'd like to thank ASPI for bringing us together too. And I've heard 2 excellent presentations this evening from Commissioner Finlay and from Lena Garcia. I feel I should address the definitional question at the beginning, Lorraine, which is I will be using a term criminal exploitation of people, and I haven't defined that, but I will now, in reference to divisions 270 and 271 of the Commonwealth Criminal Code, which sets out the offences of slavery, servitude, forced labour, forced marriage, and so on. So criminal exploitation of people defined in that way and consistent with relevant international conventions. And Lena, your presentation was so moving and presented such a comprehensive picture of exploitation of people and underscored the need for that additional referral pathway that we've discussed so often. So I commend you for your presentation this evening. For me, I'd like to just speak a little bit about Anti-Slavery Australia, then make some very dry comments about the agriculture visa and the PALM framework, discuss responses to these visas, and then I have a list of recommendations that I'd like to make, primarily to government and particularly to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And I think that there are opportunities to collaborate and to work cooperatively to really strengthen the frameworks that we have in place. And I have read the available documentation about the visas that I've mentioned. I'm very impressed by the depth of that documentation, both at Home Affairs and DFAT. But I do think that there are measures that we can take cooperatively that would strengthen our frameworks. I forgot to take a note of the time, John, so I'm going to be relying on you. Let me go on. So Anti-Slavery Australia at the University of Technology, Sydney, has been in operation for close to 18 years. we do research and policy development, and significantly in this context, we have a legal service staffed by 2 lawyers, 2 expert lawyers, a host of pro bono legal agencies and students to provide legal advice and representation to over 400 people currently. The majority of our clients are women, and we do have a cohort of our clients who have been exploited in the agricultural sector. And like Lena, I can speak to that context, but I won't tonight because I'm focused on other things. But really, the insight that we've gained through working directly with people who have experienced slavery in Australia has informed so much of our policy, and which will underscore the reasons for the recommendations that I will make. So we have now I'm going to speak about the visas, and it turns out that the frameworks are actually quite complicated. It took me a while to be able to to work out what exactly was the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, the PALM scheme, and the Australian Agricultural Visa, but I think I've worked it out now. And essentially, there were 2 different frameworks, but now they've been brought under one umbrella, which is administered by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the Australian Agriculture Visa is now part of the PALM scheme. And this is a decision taken by government and announced by press release on the 15th of July, I think it was. And the government has said that the reason that they've created this new expanded framework is to strengthen our partnerships with the Pacific. And it is an important part of Australia's foreign affairs suite of activities in that sense. And the program's been a huge success. So thinking both about the agriculture visa and the PALM framework, I was very surprised to see that as of 2nd of April this year, there were 23,000 Pacific and Timorese people in Australia, with 9,000 expected to arrive between April and October, and another 52,000 in the pipeline. So it's obviously hugely popular visa frameworks that we have in place to encourage cooperation and partnership with countries in our region. And the prime reason that these visas have been developed is to, apart from the foreign affairs potential here to enhance dialogue and partnership, but to address labour shortages significantly in the agriculture industry. So in horticulture, dairy, wool, grains, fisheries, forestry, and so on. So the schemes themselves are set out in technical detail in the migration regulations. They're administered by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Other government departments have input into these as well, but they have been designed to provide a pathway for people to come to Australia from the region to fill labour shortages. Now, while the schemes eventually are considered to expand to skilled occupations, the focus right now is on semi-skilled and unskilled labour to fill that much needed labour gap. Now, not surprisingly, the response to the visas has been quite fragmented and complex. Employers are largely in favour of the scheme, and I've got some research that I don't think I'm going to have time to speak to you about, but quoting various representatives of agricultural industries being in favour and explaining that the streamlined PALM scheme is especially valuable. By contrast, the unions are highly critical of the operation of these schemes. In particular, the Australian Workers Union has argued that the schemes will create a culture of exploitation And only last week, the AWU passed a resolution at its national conference to call on the government to crack down on exploitation of foreign fruit pickers. And the AWU says that although palm workers were often earning over $800 a week, the take-home pay was subject to deductions for accommodation, food, water, safety gear, rapid antigen tests, visa costs, and so on. And the ACTU has expressed similar concerns. So in an environment where we have a visa framework that is intended to be beneficial, to provide partnership to countries in our region and provide people in the region with an opportunity to work in Australia and secure income and make decisions based on financial security, there is a potential for labour exploitation. We've heard about that from Lena. We know that the unions are also concerned about this. So there are practices that we can consider right now. I think I'll be moving to that section that really will enhance the Australian response. And I have a list of recommendations here at the very end of a very long set of notes. But essentially, these definitions or these recommendations are designed to boost information acquisition between people. And what's happened now is I've completely lost my notes, so that's great. I'll just speak to you directly. So I should have done it at the beginning. I'm very, very concerned that there's a lack of information about the operation of these visas. There is a potential for government to establish a consultative body that brings together stakeholders, yes, business unions, but agencies like the Red Cross as well, Salvation Army, and importantly, visa holders themselves, to really to consult about the operation of the visas, to make recommendations about designing more effective schemes, but flagging areas of concern and areas for opportunity so that there can be a better response developed. Clearly, there needs to be more training done of frontline workers and communities about labour exploitation generally, but particularly around criminal labour exploitation. This is modern slavery described in another way, but there is a clear lack of information about that. I am aware that Australian Border Force and our Attorney Generals will be focusing on broadening awareness of modern slavery in Australia, but there is more to be done here. We need to support people, to provide them with grievance mechanisms when things go wrong, to enhance whistleblowing procedures, to ensure, importantly, that visa holders get information before they leave their country, on arrival, induction, and then through monitoring processes. The quality of information is really important, and bearing in mind that the cohorts of people that will be receiving initially will be working in the lower skilled areas, it's quite possible that people will need to have information provided in community languages, in written form, in oral form, and including by image for people who may be illiterate. But this information must be available clearly and in a way that's retrievable more than once. It has to be meaningful information, which is followed up on arrival through induction processes. And then
Jennifer, I'm going to have to just cut in and use my moderator's hook, and I will talk later and apologise profusely. I know.
I should just finish the sentence though, John.
I'm sorry.
You don't want to cut me off mid-sentence. In conclusion, adoption of these measures really would enhance the human rights of vulnerable people. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Look, I'm going to introduce now and hand over to the research manager at Walk Free, Elise Gordon, who's joined us here and has managed to not have COVID.
Good evening, everyone. Yes, I was the last one standing tonight. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. This is my first in-person presentation post-COVID, so it's very exciting, a little bit terrifying. So yes, I'm with Walk Free. Walk Free, for those of you who don't know about us, we are an international human rights organisation. We're focused on the eradication of modern slavery in all its forms. And we aim to do this through high quality research, which then informs our engagement and advocacy with government, business, civil society, and faith communities. And as an example of our engagement with the business community, for example, we act as the Secretariat of the Bali Process Business and Government Forum. In terms of our research, we are the authors of the Global Estimates of Modern Slavery, which we produce in partnership with the International Labour Organisation and the International Organisation for Migration. And that is the source of the 40.3 million figure that Lorraine mentioned at the top of the evening. And I might just mention that we actually have the next edition of the Global Estimates being released next month. So watch this space for an update on that global figure and also the regional breakdowns. So that's 4 years of work that we're very excited to almost be able to release. We also produce the Global Slavery Index, which presents national level prevalence estimates of modern slavery for 167 countries. It also includes assessments of the strength of government responses to modern slavery for 181 countries. And that assessment of government response is a holistic framework of a government response. So it includes supporting victims, having a strong criminal justice mechanisms, addressing risk factors, having national and regional coordination and collaboration regionally as well, and also addressing forced labour in government and business supply chains. And I should also flag that there is also the next edition, the 5th edition of the Global Slavery Index being released at the end of the year. At the start of 2020, we also released our Murky Waters report, which was a qualitative assessment of the nature of modern slavery in the Pacific region. And that came from interviews with stakeholders in 6 Pacific Island countries, as well as Australia and New Zealand. So I will draw on the findings of our Murky Waters report and the Global Slavery Index Government Responses Assessment to discuss regional implications and opportunities as they relate to addressing modern slavery in the agricultural sector. So, as I mentioned, regional coordination and collaboration is a core component of a strong government response to modern slavery, and it enables the protection of people not only in other countries within our region, but also workers within Australia. This is because for many migrants, the vulnerability to modern slavery begins at home. Findings from our Murky Waters research indicate that because of poorly regulated recruitment agents in Pacific Island countries, some migrants from these countries arrive in Australia with large debts that need to be repaid, and this then makes them vulnerable in that if there is exploitation that does occur with their new employer in Australia, then they have limited resources, if any resources, to actually be able to leave that situation. So, as was mentioned, I believe by Lorraine, Australia has one of the strongest responses to modern slavery. The strongest response regionally, but one of the strongest responses globally. So we're ranked 7th in terms of how we respond to modern slavery. And this reflects both capacity and political will. And the government is also taking action in terms of regional coordination. And again, Lorraine mentioned that the launch of the International Engagement Strategy on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery by the government at the start of the year. And that outlines how the government is collaborating regionally on modern slavery issues. And exactly as Lorraine said, the ASEAN Act program is a great example of that happening. So there are 2 key measures that are needed to protect migrant workers abroad and in Australia. These include the regulation of recruitment agents and the establishment of legislation or policies that ensure that recruitment fees are not paid by the migrant worker. So among major sending countries to the Australian agricultural sector, these include the Pacific Island countries and potentially soon might include India and Vietnam. Only Vietnam registers and monitors recruitment agencies, and only Papua New Guinea has laws or policies that stipulate that employees do not pay for recruitment fees. And I know that the government has had a hand in developing the recruitment policies in Vietnam, and it would be fantastic to see that expanded, that work with other countries that are sending countries to Australia expanded. Additionally, respondents of our Murky Waters research called for a regional mandate on modern slavery that prioritises and coordinates action on legislation, enforcement, service provision, and protection. Vulnerability to modern slavery among workers in Australia's agricultural sector can also be addressed by creating pathways to permanent migration and addressing the separation of families involved in these schemes. Australia's immigration system currently has few options for low-skilled Pacific peoples to permanently migrate to Australia and has led to some migrants from Pacific Island countries overstaying visas and continuing to work in Australia illegally. This leaves them vulnerable to threats from employers who play on the fears of deportation. Finding from our Murky Waters research suggests that fear of missing out on future work opportunities in Australia, both for the workers themselves, but also their family members and other community members, has led to a fear of reporting exploitation among workers on labour mobility programs. Furthermore, there is likely to be increasing demand for permanent migration to Australia as the effects of climate change impact health, safety and livelihoods of those in Pacific Island countries and territories. We welcome comments from the Labor government signalling intent for reforms that improve protections for migrant workers in Australia, as well as considering family accompaniment and permanent residency. Keeping families together also helps to address Pacific people's concerns about the impact of seasonal worker schemes on vulnerability to modern slavery at home in their countries. With child protection, domestic violence, and the economic insecurity that dependence of workers on these schemes sometimes experience as a result of long periods of family separation. And there's significant concerns held by Pacific people in labour sending countries. So in addition to regional coordination and collaboration, addressing risks, identifying victims and remediating survivors of modern slavery in government and business supply chains is a core component of a strong government response to modern slavery. Walk-free reports show that reporting requirements alone are not effective and that stronger laws are needed to see real action. With Australia's Modern Slavery Act currently under review, we ask for several measures that will strengthen the Act so that it has greater potential to protect workers in supply chains, including those that touch the Australian agricultural sector. These include implementing financial penalties for non-compliance so that there are consequences for not meeting mandatory criteria, going beyond mandatory reporting to include mandatory due diligence, including identifying supply chain risks and taking appropriate steps to address and remediate victims. Lowering the revenue threshold for reporting entities so that it is not only the largest businesses that are addressing modern slavery risks in their supply chains. Appointing an independent anti-slavery commissioner to oversee implementation of the Act and monitor the government's response to modern slavery beyond just tackling forced labour in supply chains. And finally, adding a further 3-year review so there is a mechanism for constant improvement. So to summarise, more can be done to work with our neighbours to reduce vulnerability that starts in other countries in our region and continues in Australia. This includes going beyond temporary work. We also need a stronger Modern Slavery Act that results in genuine action by Australian businesses to identify and resolve forced labour and remediate victims. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elise. We've got, and I'll probably try to extend it to 10 minutes, but we've got some time for questions. Normally I'd sit there and steal the chair's prerogative, but I'm going to go straight into it and try while our audience prepares and their questions. But from online, I'll perhaps Elise, you might be able to answer this one. Is how can or are our primary producers being engaged to combat modern slavery and to emphatically reject a culture of exploitation?
Primary producers. And I think, to be honest, there's probably more to be done in terms of really engaging with business, but certainly forums like the Bali Process are a fantastic way of engaging business. And that's, that engages business across the Indo-Pacific region. So I think that's certainly a start. And I think, discussing more the Modern Slavery Act, having those conversations really, and bringing in the business community is certainly a good way.
Do we have any questions in the audience? Otherwise, I'll continue with these ones. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Jenny. How you doing? I have a question about how you're engaging with it seems similar to that around the producers and bringing them involved, but the actual companies that are the employers on the ground here. I know there's like an accredited scheme, but how are we going about checking with them that they're talking to the workers and getting like a voice from the workers to get a bigger sort of sample size of what's going on? Is there anything in that sort of capacity?
I'm going to play the game of passing these out in the name of speed. I wonder, Lena, if you wanted to, from a victim perspective, just address that question.
Yeah, sure. I think that one of the biggest recommendations that can really be given is support freedom of association for workers and recognize the union's rights to inspect farms, to inspect factories, and like employer provided accommodation as the first instance, just to really allow people free association and a way of raising awareness and raising concerns that is outside of their employers, and that probably is the only opportunity that they have to raise their concerns. And I would imagine, the reason why I say this is because with one of the project that we are implementing, the Work Right Hub is called, as part of the consultations that we have done across different states and territories, one of the biggest things that we have identified is the lack of connectedness of migrant workers to the real world. Once they are in the farms, once they are in potentially exploitative practices, there's nothing that they will be able to do to raise their concerns and seek help and advice, unless it's online or unless the service approaches the farm. So that's why, as a potential suggestion, tapping into what the unions can do.
Thanks, Lena. Jennifer, I've got about 3 different questions here, which I'll roll into one because they're all very similar, which is, we're talking about modern slavery, and this, all 3 questions touch on this. Is there in fact an old school slavery, and is there a possibility of a postmodern slavery? And I see the Commissioner is laughing about this because it is all definitions.
Yeah, I really like that question. I had a bit of a go at answering it in the chat, but modern slavery, it's really an advocacy term. It's intended to bring slavery back to the table. Slavery is always slavery. Slavery is control. It's taking away fundamental human rights. It doesn't look any different now than it looked thousands of years ago. There are other forms of slavery now. It might be facilitated through globalization and so on, but the actual essence of slavery is absolutely the same. Modern slavery is a term that's used for advocacy and convenience.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I might just add to that as well. And I think, I think Jen touched on it, but, as technology evolves as well, then, perpetrators, they sort of roll with the times and the technology. And so obviously, during COVID, you saw a real movement of exploitation to online. And so I think as, technology does change, they will unfortunately find a way to utilize that for exploitation.
We've got a question from Professor James Cocaine now, who's also the New South Wales newly appointed Modern Slavery Commissioner.
Thanks, John. Trying to fill some very big shoes that Jennifer Byrne stretched while she was the interim anti-slavery commissioner in New South Wales a couple of years ago. And you'll forgive me if I don't have all the answers, being only 13 days into the job. But I was very struck by this recurring reference to fragmentation in the response and in the regimes. And I guess my question to the panel is really, what do we see in the Commonwealth reporting statements about this problem on the agricultural side? Are the entities that are reporting under the Commonwealth regime identifying this risk in their supply chains in Australia? And if they are identifying it, are they reporting doing anything about it at this point? And if they're not, what does that mean for regulatory coherence or incoherence going forward? Thanks.
And I think, Jennifer, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I'd love to start off with that one. Hello, James. Welcome tonight. I'm really thrilled to be working with you and look forward to doing that into the future. In terms of your particular question, there are some reporting entities that are dealing with this in the statements that they lodge and identifying the risk of modern slavery in workforce, in the agricultural sector, and some are creating remedies, so grievance mechanisms, whistleblowing, and so on. But one of the problems we have with the reporting structure as it is that there is very little oversight of the whole of the scheme. And the idea originally was that market forces would regulate and monitor the quality of statements that were being lodged. And to some extent, that does happen. But there is a gap there. But I guess the other part of this, just leaving aside the reporting scheme, is that so many of the businesses that I think are involved in employing people through the PALM scheme or the Australian Agriculture Scheme are smaller businesses, so they are not likely to be reporting entities. And this is where the point about cooperation and partnership becomes absolutely critical, together with increased training and awareness raising, both for visa holders, but also the range of business entities that have involvement in employing people from the region.
Thanks, Jennifer. I noticed that we are now 4 minutes over our time, and my colleagues, who are the coordinators of all things time, are giving me the slow wind up. First and foremost, I wanted to, on behalf of everyone here, thank our keynote speaker, Commissioner Finlay, and thank my now friends and colleagues from Walk Free, from Red Cross, and Professor, I'm so sorry for cutting off you off early. So if you could join me in showing your appreciation to begin with. Thank you very much. I won't do any form of justice trying to sum up some of the amazing content and commentary that was said tonight. Suffice to say, the thing that stuck in my mind is the moral stain of modern slavery. The figures in terms of globally and nationally, in terms of modern slavery, and the very personal accounts provided by Lena. With that in mind, we've got a lot of work to do to ensure our continued lead globally in our fight against modern slavery. And that includes both here in Australia and our agricultural industry, and in terms of our supply chains that extend across the world. With that in mind, and I'm sorry that our people who are dialing in with COVID and isolation can't join us, but for our physical audience here, please feel free to come and join us for a drink and some formal conversation. But thank you very much for your time as well. Thank you.